I found in the next phase that leaving the Army proved as momentous a decision for young soldiers and young officers as joining. And I'd point you to two great quotes. "You ask me, my dear father, what bounds I have set to my desire of serving my country in a military line?" This is John Lawrence writing to his father, Henry, in 1778. "I answer, glorious death, or the triumph of the cause in which we are engaged." Way to go, John. I love that. You got to contrast that quote, which is truly heartfelt, with an equally heartfelt quote from Sergeant Benjamin Gilbert. At the end of 1779, he writes in his diary, he's counting down the days left in a 3-year enlistment. "Cold and windy. This day, 2 months, I am a free man." Both of them thinking about leaving the Army, both of them thinking about it in very different ways, both of them thinking about it in the middle of a war that they don't know when will stop. I argued that as the war progressed, young Continentals realized that the only way they could advance in life was by getting out of the Army. A failed currency, long enlistments, these threatened their paths forward. For some, other military opportunities, like privateering, beckon. So as with enlistment, young soldiers' choices about leaving the Army determine the capabilities of Washington's Army. I'd like to share with you an example of how looking at youth in the Continental Army, particularly in relation to leaving, challenges long-held interpretations and helps shift the narrative. I'd like to talk about the crisis at Newburgh in 1783 as a case study. I look at Newburgh within the context of young officers thinking about leaving the Army, thinking about their post-war lives, and their anxieties about those post-war lives. So, early March 1783, 2 anonymous addresses in the Newburgh cantonment denounced the callous financial irresponsibility of the Continental government and called on officers to remain in arms until Congress and the states made them whole. Historians have traditionally viewed the so-called Newburgh Conspiracy in terms of congressional machinations or factions within the Army's general staff, basically Gates versus Washington, or as a precursor to attempts to reform the Articles of Confederation. When we view the conspiracy from below, however, we see the central place in this crisis of long-serving young Continental officers and their anxieties. The public voice of the Newburgh Conspiracy, the voice that I think matters most, is that of Major John Armstrong, a 24-year-old aide-de-camp to General Horatio Gates. He wrote the 2 anonymous addresses. Armstrong was a Pennsylvanian who had joined the Army in 1776 as a 17-year-old volunteer cadet. He wrote the addresses with General Gates's knowledge, but was not a cat's paw or a proxy. Armstrong had spent his entire adolescence as a Continental officer. He belonged to a cadre of hundreds of young men who had only ever been soldiers. Apart from the Army, they have no foundation for their public identities, no foundation for status as independent men. One civilian observes at the time, "Those officers without wealth or family influence fear their respectability will be lost by separation and their pretensions derided." Now, certainly they had found the self-importance and pomp and honor of an officer's life more inviting and pleasant than the civilian lives to which they were potentially returning. And Continental officers' earlier demands for pensions were similarly motivated by both financial need and a craving for continued public recognition and respect for their role in leading the United States to its independence. For young officers, these fears are magnified by their liminal civilian positions. Clearly, these are no longer boyish youths, but they are not necessarily respectable men, particularly if they no longer wear the uniform of their country or the epaulets of an officer. In his first address, Armstrong speaks directly to these young men and to their masculine status in the post-war civilian sphere. Though he has cloaked himself in anonymity, he does explicitly and purposefully reveal his youth and his subordinate rank. He's writing to young Continental officers as one of their own, and he prophesies that Congress's financial neglect will leave them emasculated after the war. When these swords, these instruments and companions of your glory, shall be taken from your sides, you veteran officers would lose every mark of military distinction but your wants, infirmities, and scars. Could you consent to grow old in poverty, wretchedness, and contempt, to wade through the vile mire of dependency, and owe the miserable remnant of your life to charity? Would they exchange the honor of their service for the ridicule, and worse, the pity of the world? Go, starve, be forgotten. Just as humiliation and oblivion are the inversion of honor and glory, poverty and dependence are the opposite of manly competence and independence. The substance of Armstrong's diatribe against Congress spoke to the ambitions and anxieties of his fellow officers, young men like himself. Armstrong calls his brother officers to action as true men of arms and honor. To accept Congress's recent promises meant sinking into cowardice. To be tame, Armstrong declares, to be tame when injuries press hard upon you is more than weakness. To submit without one manly effort of your own would permanently fix your character. Fix your character. Here he sounds like the ubiquitous manuals of behavior that fathers push on their sons in the 18th century. He urges his fellow officers, change the milk and water style, reject the suing, soft, and unsuccessful tenor that they had used in previous petitions. Instead, assume a bolder tone, decent but lively, spirited, determined, all of which are qualities of a true man in or out of the army. By remaining in arms until Congress meets their financial demands, they would hold on to the manly identity that an impoverished return to civilian life would extinguish. If Congress still refuses them, Armstrong proposes the officers remove to some unsettled country and abandon the unworthy republic to its enemies, and then mock as their fear cometh on. Not only does this language present young officers with a vision of a utopian society in which young veterans find the soldierly attributes of bravery, virtue, honor, rather than the economic competence as the sole definition of adult manhood. He's basically laying out a poor young gentleman's fantasy. Shocked by the revolt, Washington attempts to regain control of his subordinates. He forbade the meeting proposed by Armstrong's letter, and then he calls one of his own, and then he makes the surprise, dramatic appearance. Presentations of Washington's speech at this meeting skip over a key and crucial point. His first prepared statement did not turn the gathered officers away from their threatened mutiny. His speech did not work. The reason, I argue, was that he had misread the room. He had misread his audience. His prepared remarks denounced the author of the anonymous addresses, possibly as a British agent who had stirred up irrational passions. This insults the officers before him, who, like Armstrong, saw their grievances as legitimate and held a high sense of themselves as patriots. Next, Washington asks them to trust Congress. This is now beyond their ability to do. He asked his officers to trust him as a faithful friend of the army. After all, his reputation was inseparably connected to it. But the officers are concerned about post-war competency. They're not concerned about intangible renown. But Washington's most striking misstep was to mock Armstrong's proposal to remove into the unsettled country. Could our wives, our children, our farms, and other property be abandoned? Washington asks. Are we to take them to perish in a wilderness with hunger, cold, and nakedness? Washington's hypothetical question means nothing to young officers without wives, without children, without farms, without property of their own. It only fans their anxious rage against congressional neglect and incompetence. With the crowd of officers still against him at the end of his prepared remarks, Washington has to stall for time. He riffs. He reaches into his pocket. He pulls out a letter that he had from Congress. He tries to read some reassuring statements of congressional promises, but he has trouble with the small text, the unfamiliar handwriting. And as one of the young officers in attendance recorded, the general made a short pause, took out his spectacles, and begged their indulgence as he put them on, observing that he had grown gray in their service and now found himself growing blind. This otherwise unimaginable sign of Washington's personal frailty, the father who had grown old before them. This proves the decisive moment. This proves the memorable moment. This is the only thing people know or remember about Newburgh unless they're really super in the nerd club. I'm in the nerd club. In this personal display, Washington reminds his officers of their feelings of personal loyalty, their feelings of obligation to the man who embodied their revolutionary struggle, as well as their sense of themselves as a patriotic group. And the officers wept. And while their would-be mutinous comrades were overcome by the sentiment of the moment, Washington's lieutenants grab control of the meeting, draft a statement of support for Congress, for Washington, denouncing the anonymous threats. One officer rages, in a letter to another officer, rages at his comrades' fickleness for having damned with infamy 2 publications, which during the 4 preceding days, most of them had read with admiration and had talked of with rapture. They had been undone by their love and their loyalty towards the father of their country. Promises, careful political rhetoric could not convince Washington's officers. Armstrong's arguments aimed at his fellow young officers worked, still worked, but with sentiment and with obligation. Washington could inspire his loving military sons to renewed deference.